Okay, all right. Hey, hello everyone. It's me, Profesor here, and let me just try to fix up some lighting here. Okay, I think you guys can see me just fine. All right. Well, I'm broadcasting here in the French Valley home office, home headquarters, and what I'm going to do for you guys is give you the first of three videos in which I talk at length about the Ken Burns jazz program. You're starting that this week. There's going to be 10 parts to it, and even though it might seem like a daunting task to watch all of those episodes. And anyone who's seen any of Ken Burns' stuff, especially his epic Civil War series in 1990 and then baseball in 1994, knows that Burns' style, while excellent and detailed and intriguing, can be a bit plodding or prodding, I guess whatever that term is, really move in many cases at sort of a dinosaur's pace. But I'll help you get through some of those sections. I've got plenty of resources to go along with it. First and foremost, you've got the study guides for each episode, and in these videos, I'll have three of them. This one to introduce the series, do a quick preview of episodes 1 through 5, and then I'll have another video in the middle of the series, give you a preview of episodes 6 through 10, and then one to wrap things up, which will be the video which will immediately precede the due date for the comparative essay, in which you're going to compare and contrast themes from two of the 10 parts. So you watch all 10, but the two that you like the most, compare and contrast the themes of all that. I've got the assignment worksheet for you, but I'll say a few quick things about that in just a moment here. All right, well, this video might run about 20, maybe 22 minutes, so I'm going to do three things for you in this video. First, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick preview of the assignment guidelines, the parameters themselves, the nuts and bolts, the inner workings, the gears, the machinery of the assignment. So I've got the assignment worksheet queued up, not on paper, but on my iPad. So if you have the assignment worksheet with you, whether it's stored in your tablet or you got the paper format, excellent. Have it with you. Maybe pause the video, then get that, because I want to read off a few of the points on the assignment worksheet. So that'll be the first third of the video, and then the second part of the video, I'll do a quick recap or quick review, preview, I should say, of what you're going to be seeing in parts 1 through 5. So instead of doing one video per each part, I'll talk about the first half, a little bit about some of the people, the themes you'll be looking at in episodes 1 through 5. Uh, That'll take the middle third of this video, and then in the final third, I want to go ahead and tell you a little bit more about why I'm doing this. Maybe when you got the syllabus and you saw this firsthand, you might be thinking, what is the professor thinking here? This seems rather daunting. This seems like maybe something more that somebody from the music department would show. I don't like jazz. I don't like that stuff. It's all noise. I like Katy Perry, Bon Jovi, Rihanna, Beyonce, Eminem, all of that stuff. This is old people music. You might be thinking about that, but I think there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye. So I'm going to try to address that in the remaining third of the video. Anyways, sit back. Let's go ahead and get things rolling, and I'll talk a little bit more about the parameters, the gears, the nuts and bolts of the assignment. And first, let me get my iPad here queued up and get the directions. Okay, all right. First off, everybody, the assignment that you have to do is due on Friday, May the 8th. So we're talking about just a little bit over 2 months, maybe about 2.5 months down the road. And like with the other assignments, the book review and also the EBSCO assignment, this is to be done in Microsoft Word. So turn in your form in paper in either docx format, PDF is fine too, or if you have Apple, of course, I'll accept your papers in pages format too. Uh, so as long as it's in those formats and you send it through the assignment section, you'll be good to go. This thing's going to be worth 15% of your class grade, and I want your paper to be at least 5 to 6 pages in length. And remember, everybody, if you're doing a title page, that page length number does not include title page. So if you give me something with the 5 pages, but one of it is a title page, I'm only going to count 4 pages of text, and you will be marked down for that. So remember, everybody, the 5 to 6 pages means the 5 pages of text, not including a title page. All right, there are three things you need to do for the assignment. Again, you can read this in more detail on your own time in the assignment worksheet. But just a quick recap of the main points. The first part is, do give me a quick review, summarize the main points of the two episodes that you chose. So whether you chose one of the early episodes with the turn of the century, the 1890s, 1900s, the early days of Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, those people, how the country was changing in the post-Civil War era, Jim Crow, uh, the problems that African Americans were facing in the turn of the century. Definitely talk about some of those key points and who the major artists were in the episode. So whether it was people like Jelly Roll Morton, a little bit about Louis Armstrong, Freddie Kepler, those people. So talk about that. And then, in another paragraph, another couple of paragraphs down the line that talk about later episodes. So maybe if you're talking about one of the episodes that talks about the post-World War II. So that, of course, is people like John Coltrane, uh, Charlie Parker. That's what get the rise of what's known as the bebop sound. So talk a little bit about what those guys are doing. Lester Young, Billie Holiday is in that time frame. So talk a little bit about their style, their music, their songs. So basically, for about the first maybe about the first a third of your paper, you're giving me a summary of some of the key events and people, places, names, songs, styles, all of that stuff in in the two episodes. So you're basically being objective. You're like a music reporter on the scene, talking about what's happening with these types of styles of music and what the artists are all about. All right, then about the middle third of your essay, then go ahead and start talking more about what's happening in terms of the United States. What are some of the events happening in each of those episodes? So again, you go back to about the first episode, talk about here's where we talk more about Jim Crow, the post-Reconstruction period, the Plessy versus Ferguson case. What I like about this series is that Ken Burns does a pretty good job of giving you a sense of what's happening on a historical, political, social background. So you're not really lost to per se. So following along with what the Who Built America text that talks about, and to a lesser extent, some of the PowerPoint programs, Burns, in essence, addresses that as the narrator Keith David talks about a lot of these events, happening. Likewise, if you do an episode which talks about, which is an episode based on the swing era, where people like Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw come in. Of course, you want to talk about World War II. What's happening with, of course, in Europe, the military, Patton, Eisenhower, MacArthur, all of those, the home front, Rosie the Riveter. So a lot of things that maybe you would read about in Who Built America, comment on those things. Then about the middle third of your essay, and the final part of the essay, try to reserve about two paragraphs in which you give me your overall view of this. How did the two episodes connect with your notion of modern U.S. history? What types of things from the episodes really caught your attention in terms of whether it was a historical event, a political event, or maybe something in the music of Charlie Parker, of John Coltrane, Stan Getz, Ornette Coleman, people of that category, and of course Miles Davis as well. So basically, the final couple of paragraphs are just tying up your thoughts and give me your final perspective, your final analysis that is on what all of this essentially means to you. So again, I get into more detail about what I expect in the assignment worksheet. So definitely, if you have the worksheet with you, you just read along with on the worksheet with what I've been saying these last couple of minutes. Okay, and then in the second page of the worksheet, because the worksheet came in just a little over a page, about a page and a third, I do have a breakdown in terms of how you should structure your paragraphs, in terms of what you should do in each paragraph. So if you have about 9 or 10 paragraphs, I tell you in the second page of the worksheet basically what items you should be doing in each of the paragraphs. And on the note of paragraphs, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the EBSCO video, but I'll say it here again, watch the length, everybody, please. Don't give anything that's super short, like 2 or 3 sentences, or excessively long, in which a paragraph runs for about a page and a half. Please avoid that stuff like the plague, like the measles, to take a contemporary story in this context. Um, the, you really have to have good coherent, cogent paragraphs to really address the issue that you're looking at. So as long as you give me good paragraph lengths, somewhere in the range of, say, maybe about a half a page to a three-quarters of a page, maybe 7/8 of a page, not quite a full page, then you're in the ballpark. As long as you keep that format, that style for the entirety of your paper, you'll be in good shape, and you'll be in great shape to get a high grade, to get high marks on this assignment. Okay, so there you have it, everybody. So just a recap of some of the key points, the parameters, and again, this thing is going to be due on Friday, May the 8th. But if you turn it in on May the 15th, and just before the semester wraps up, I will accept it, but there will be a one grade deduction. But for the full credit, definitely make sure you get it in to me by Friday, May 8th. Okay, now the next thing I want to do right now is quickly say a few things about what you're going to be seeing in each episode. So, for more detailed information about the episodes, like again, just go into the course document section, and it's the last folder I have inside the course documents in which I have a episode guide. So the guides will indicate key players, key people. So of course Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, I'll mention that. Maybe I'll mention song titles. So whether it's songs like Stardust, West End Blues, um, Strange Fruit, The Girl from Ipanema, those types of things. So I'll mention that, and also music styles too, dances. So whether I mention phrases such as bebop, hard bop, West Coast jazz, swing, of course. I'll mention those in the I'll mention those in the study guides, and there will of course be study guides for each episode. The episode one study guide is now ready to go for you. All right. Episode one starts up. Episode one is entitled Gumbo, and basically it talks about what's happening in New Orleans after the Civil War. The story actually begins in the early parts of the 19th century, where of course New Orleans was a market for slavery, and of course it mentions some of the culture of slaves in 19th century New Orleans. But things began to change with the Union occupation during the Civil War, and and what the and what the what's illustrated during the episode is how the Civil War, you might say, really enhanced or brought in some items, elements that helped to bring about the birth of jazz. And on that note too, the, the story mentions other music styles. So whether it's the blues, ragtime, gospel, all these things meshed in. There's also coverage of just the classic, you might say, hoity-toity stuff like the symphony and the opera. That fits in too. So just like with a gumbo, where there's all kinds of stuff in there, whether it's fish, whether it's meats, of course, rice or roux, as it's called in French, uh, as uh, as the famous trumpeter Wynton Marsalis, who's basically like the second voice of the video, besides Keith David, the narrator. Marsalis does a great job of really giving you a sense of the style, the aesthetic of musicians, so to speak. So so in talking about gumbo in terms of a food, you mix all kinds of stuff together. Marcel essentially says that in New Orleans you had all these different music styles coming in, and jazz is in essence a bit like a gumbo. I try to say. Okay, the episode goes on, talks about people like Buddy Bolden, Jelly Roll Morton, Sidney Bechet, one of the early famed clarinetists. So one of the early influences for people like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, who were popular during the World War II era. Sidney Bechet was the first to really make the clarinet a popular instrument. Then it talks about dances and some of the early African American band leaders too. So when you hear about people like Duke Ellington and Count Basie, they were notable as band leaders besides being musicians, piano players. It mentions people like James Reese Europe, who was one of the first African American band leaders during the early parts of the 20th century. Okay. Then the episode also talks about a little bit about some of the first white musicians and the white band leaders too. These were the guys, not surprisingly, who got more, shall we say, popularity. Even though the African Americans were the ones who, you might say, did the hard work early on. But remember, we're talking about the 1910s, it's 1920s. Segregation was still in effect years after the Civil War. Okay, episode two is called The Gift, and the focus here is on the origins of Louis Armstrong's rise to power. So the time frame of the episode takes into the World War I era, where there's a lot of rapid modernization going on. We're talking about flight, X-ray photography, and of course modern and abstract art. We're talking about the work of Freud, of Picasso, of Albert Einstein. So you might say by the World War I era, and of course the horrors of the war shows how technology increases the carnage of war, the fast pace in technology in terms of moving pictures. Uh, at the time, of course, incandescent light bulb with Thomas Edison, all of those guys. That all those rapid changes in the country in the 1910s into 1920s is being reflected by the music, and of course the early phonographs, the Victrola, that comes into scene. So that's mentioned quite a bit in episode two, and some of the first jazz recordings. So these were some of the things that are mentioned, and also besides Louis Armstrong, some of the other white artists like Bix Beiderbecke and Jack Teagarden. These guys are mentioned in episode two as well. There's also coverage of Duke Ellington. So Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, they're contemporaries at the time. Both Armstrong, of course, known as Satchmo, and Ellington had different styles and techniques in terms of the way they could carry and conduct themselves. But the influence of those two guys is really can't be stressed enough. And their early work is covered quite nicely. Their early influences here in episode two. And let me see what else I should mention about episode two. Okay. All right, yeah, that's pretty much all I need to mention about episode two. But again, Armstrong and Duke Ellington, they're the feature players in episode two. Episode three takes into the 1920s, and here, of course, where we get into the era of the Jazz Age, the works of Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, uh, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, the whole Lost Generation era. So that's covered extensively in part three. And some of the early female artists that come on this, people like Bessie Smith, Maxine Waters, they're mentioned here in episode three as well. And of course, this is the era of prohibition. Ironically, the federal government's attempt to ban the sale, the distribution, and consumption of alcoholic beverages, that seems to backfire, and in essence, all the rules are broken, all the social norms, social mores, those are thrown out the window. So here's where you see the rise of the famous clubs like the Cotton Club in Harlem in New York. That's mentioned extensively here in episode three. And also we see the early days of Benny Goodman, of course, the famed white band leader who's really popular leading up to the World War II period. Benny Goodman was a famous clarinetist, and Benny Goodman, to his credit, he was one of the first white musicians to really bring in African American artists, even though a lot of social customs, mores, as it were, preventing whites and blacks from intermingling. But during off hours, when I guess you might say nobody was looking in the clubs in places like Chicago, New York, and of course in Kansas City, and let alone New Orleans, we're seeing a lot more intermixing between whites and blacks by the mid to late 1920s. So all of that is covered quite a bit in chapter three. It's called part three is called our language. Okay, part four is called the true welcome, and here is where we get to the start of the Depression era. So it seemed that the music at the time was really fast paced, frenetic, and hectic. But much like the booming stock market, the music was so fast paced, and it was reaching a crescendo, or a point in which things were going to crash. And sure enough, once the depression began, the music began to change too. You might say there's a little bit more of a introspective type of themes happening here, and this really the case with some of the female artists who came on the scene. And of course, we're talking about people like Billie Holiday. And actually, Billie Holiday was mentioned more in part five. So I kind of get a little bit ahead of myself here in part four. But let me just quickly recap some of the people we meet in part four. We meet other African American artists like Fletcher Henderson, Fats Waller, Art Tatum. Okay, and of course, and also a little bit more about Duke Ellington at this time. So roughly from about the mid 20s to the early 1930s, That's the era that's covered here in part four. So still a lot of excitement going on with respect to events happening in Harlem at the famous so at the famous Savoy Ballroom. That's mentioned prominently here in part four. And then to wrap up, let me say a few things about part five. And part five is called Swing Pure Pleasure. And this takes us into the mid 1930s. Of course, we're talking about the Depression era, and there's a little bit more coverage here. People like Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, Glenn Miller, the Dorsey brothers. So what's happening here during this time is that even though people can't buy music, because one thing that you see that's quite apparent in some of the earlier episodes, again episodes more so episodes 2, 3, and into 4, is Americans become a record buying public. So that really starts to come to the forefront, and you see that quite a bit in earlier in episodes 2, 3, and 4. But what happens is when we get into radio during the time of the Great Depression, people can't afford to buy records, so they're listening to the radio. So big shows happening in the ballrooms in New York, in Chicago, and then even in tiny places in Kansas City. These things are being recorded and heard over a national audience. So it didn't matter what part of the country you were. In the 1930s, jazz was being distributed over a wider audience because of radio and that's the rise of what became known as the big band era, the early big band era. But they were based with what was then called swing. That's what was happening here. So swing actually takes 2 episodes. Ken Burns split swing up into 2 parts. He talks about it in part five, which is what I'm talking about here, and then in my next video, episode 6, he talks more about how swing feeds right into what's happened in World War II. Uh, but a little bit also about the decline of swing as well. But again, the origins of swing's heyday, its peak, that's covered extensively here in part five, and also in part five, there's a lot of coverage about the travel that the bands took. That is not so much across the country, uh, but you had these regional bands that they toured the South, they toured the Midwest, whether they was in Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, Saginaw, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, all of those places. That's the type of thing that was happening here. So much like you hear about the rock and roll bands today, whether we're talking about Rush, ZZ Top, Motley Crue, Bob Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, in which they're touring all over the place. These guys in the 1930s, these early big bands, they were the ones who, in essence, set the mold or started that. That is cramped into a bus with all their instruments, their equipment, whatever road crew they might have, maybe just a couple of people. That stuff was going on during the Depression, long before the days where bands today have their own buses, or in the case of maybe some of the bigger bands, like say maybe AC/DC or Metallica, they have their own private jets. All right, so that's what you're going to be seeing here in episodes 1 through 5. I'll of course have a little bit more coverage of some of the key terms and phrases uh, uh, in the study guides in the course documents section. All right, now to wrap things up, uh, let me just say for a couple of minutes, just illustrate as to why I wanted to do this, and maybe what it was which brought me to do this in the first place. How was it that El Profesor, uh, uh, how did he get to this point and become interested in jazz? Well, I think there were actually 2 things which happened in the last few years, which maybe compelled me to that. One is kind of a silly reason, but it's a reason nonetheless. Is I've been a long time fan of Family Guy, and one of my favorite character is Brian. I just love Brian the dog. I mean, just the fact that you got this intellectual, but he's in the body of a dog. I just find that crazy and hilarious. And those of you who know some of the early episodes, Brian's a fan of jazz. So in the other episodes, he's talked about John Coltrane, about Charlie Parker. I think he's mentioned Miles Davis a few times. So that kind of planted the seed too, and thinking, well, I wonder what this stuff is all about. Because I'd known about all these guys for a long time. Miles Davis, Stan Getz, Chet Baker, and so forth, but never really was familiar with their music. But then the second reason came a little bit more musically. I'm a big fan of Steely Dan, and the Steely Dan guys, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, they're big fans of jazz. I mean, they grew up during that time, so they grew up during a time when bebop was going on, bebop and hard bop, and then the West Coast jazz in the 1950s. So they talked about how they were influenced by what they heard when their parents brought the records because those guys back in those days, like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, they were making records left and right. They go into a session and just record a bunch of songs over about 3 or 4 days, and then maybe the next month or a couple months after that, they go into the session and record something else for a span of 3 or 4 or 5 days. So records were just churned out like crazy back in those days, and Becker and Fagan were big fans of that. Well, if you hear some of the Steely Dan stuff, even going into some of the into their later stuff, like the albums they did in 2000, 2003, you hear that influence, and their music is so hard to describe. You really can't tell if it's rock, jazz, a fusion, soul, R&B, or just a mixture of all of that. And one of the songs that Steely Dan has on their I think it's on their third album, is actually a cover of the Duke Ellington tune called East St. Louis Toodaloo. So when I so I was intrigued about that, and I guess as I was interested in listening to Steely Dan stuff, I became more and more intrigued, and then over time I began listening to all these things on Spotify. So eventually it was Stan Getz here, Billy the Holiday here, Ella Fitzgerald here, Chet Baker here, and then of course Gil Evans, and the master himself, Miles Davis, and many others. So I had that. So and then I guess you tied in with the focus of the class. I think I've always been a fan of the idea of popular culture. That is, what is it that makes Americans tick in terms of their pastimes, their hobbies, their what it is they like to do to unwind. And yes, it's very important to study all the big things, of course. So the policies of Ronald Reagan, what's happened in World War II, Hitler, Stalin, um, and foreign policy things, and of course domestic policies, the New Deal, the Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, all of that. So while we're definitely looking at all of those things in the class, I think I've always been intrigued by what do the people like? What are they into? What types of foods are they eating back in the 1930s? What was popular in Detroit in 1929 in terms of music? Um, what did people eat in Pittsburgh when the steel industry was in its heyday? And what was it about Los Angeles in the 1970s, 1980s, which gave rise to such a vibrant rock scene? Everybody from Van Halen, Motley Crue, Quiet Riot, the list goes on and on. So I've always been intrigued about that, and I always felt that jazz was like the soundtrack of the country. Because think about this, everybody. When you're looking at the modern history of the United States, you hear about the term known as the Jazz Age, the 1920s. You look at the other eras in the U.S. history, and you don't see any other um, uh, music style being attached to an era. I mean, you don't hear about really. There's really no reference to say a hip hop age, a rock age, or a heavy metal age, or a easy listening age, new wave, or whatever the term is these days. But there's always the idea of the jazz age. So that always intrigued me, and that the music uh, was so powerful, it was so penetrating, it was so pervasive in the 1920s. And what's happened in the 1920s with prohibition and all the rapid advances in terms of technology and people doing wild and crazy things, whether it was like Charles Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic. I mean, that was a really crazy and gutsy thing for him to do back in 1927. But the fact that all these wild and crazy things were happening in the 1920s, and the era had the term the Jazz Age, that always intrigued me. So I always saw jazz. I've been seeing jazz as sort of a current, an undercurrent, which is streamed in the country since the end of the Civil War. And I think the people in the film, especially the narrator and really Wynton Marsalis, excuse me, I think Wynton Marsalis really does a great job of being a second narrator, sort of the master of ceremonies as the program unfolds. So because, like I said, as I been more of a big fan of popular culture of the United States. What music style, what better music style is there, which in essence speaks about what the popular culture of the U.S. and that of course is jazz. When it comes to sports, I think Burns captured that with his baseball series he did about 6 years previously. But in terms of music, the jazz styles have been pervasive. They keep branching up. They keep modifying. They change with the times. What's happening in the country is reflected by the music, and I think we see that firsthand with a lot of stuff happening in the 30s, 40s, and into the 1950s. So I just felt it was time to do something a little bit more intriguing, a little bit more different, and focus more on the history of the people. What are the people listening to back in those days? What are they playing? What's their influence? Where are they playing? All of that. And I think Burns does a great job of capturing the essence of the people in the 20th century. And I just felt that it was high time to bring that element, bring all of that into the class, and that's why I'm doing that for you guys this semester. So again, it's quite an ambitious project. I hope it works out well. And if you guys have any concerns or questions about anything as we go on these next 10 weeks, by all means, let me know. Okay, well that's it for now. That's it here. I know ran pretty long, but I wanted to cover as much as possible, cover all the angles, all the bases, so to speak. So when I have my next video for you, we'll talk about what's happening in parts 6 through 10, and my final video at the end of the series will be a recap of all of this, what we learned from all this, and just of course as a reminder of the due date for the assignment. Okay, that's it everyone, and I'll see you guys again very soon.